If you're a B2B business, a B2B tech company, or a B2B marketer, you're in the right place. Coming to you from Studio 26, this is the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast, bringing you interesting contemporary takes, industry tips, guest interviews, and true stories from B2B marketers in the trenches. Now, here's your host, Steve Goldhaber.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Studio 26 and the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. I'm excited to have Anthony join us. Welcome, Anthony.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, all right. So before we jump into cases, let's give the audience an overview of what you've been up to and what your background is.
Yeah, so I'm a CMO by trade. I led marketing for a company called Gainsight for about 7 years. Went on to lead marketing for a company called Front in the customer communication space. And then most recently Hopin during the sort of virtual events craze of the early 2020s, I guess. One of the big lessons I learned, I think we're going to talk about it today in some of the cases, is just the power of thought leadership to not just create a big brand or kind of mobilize a community, but also to drive revenue to fuel the growth engine for a business. And so I sort of stepped down recently here from my CMO gig to launch a company called Audience Plus. So I've been in the founder chair now for about a year and a half, really around this idea about how do we help companies create rich editorial media, podcasts just like this one, distribute that content, build an audience around it, and ultimately connect that audience engagement to revenue. So it's kind of been a master's thesis of my CMO journey.
Yeah.
It's been a really exciting time.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for the background. And let's jump into the first case. So this one, you're going to walk us through kind of developing a new category that was underserved and the role of content and thought leadership and bringing that to life.
So one of the businesses that comes to mind is one that did not have sort of a existing category that they were kind of launching into. And so what the company had done originally, kind of using some just maybe big company bias kind of coming into that process, they spoke to a lot of analysts, Gartner and Forrester and others, their customers in front of them. They, did demos, all this sorts of thing. And what was interesting is the advice they got from the analysts in terms of like, how do you position the business, what category you're operating in, was aligned to the research areas that they wanted to effectively kind of sell services into. And it didn't feel authentic to the company to sort of position in that way. What they had observed was that there was a job function that existed that would effectively be the buyer of the product, but was very underserved. They did not have kind of existing budget. They didn't really have a seat at the executive table to really, make a lot of these purchasing decisions. And what the company did was actually go, and there was this like little community on LinkedIn that would get together in office parks around the Bay Area kind of every kind of month or something. And they sat in on these meetups and observed just the power of when these people got together and kind of shared their scars, shared kind of their journey, compared notes. And so kind of the light bulb moment was, what if we sort of went against kind of the analyst kind of playbook here from taking kind of a disruption play against kind of a really big entrenched incumbent in the market, and instead just found a way to champion that persona through content, through community, through all of these different kind of avenues. So that's what they did. And one of the things to talk about later is how kind of atomizing that into events and some other programs. But they effectively hosted a event that was all about thought leadership and community and best practices, nothing to do with what the vendor was doing, but everything to do with serving and educating and connecting that persona. And that turned into an entire marketing strategy, basically, that had a great turnout for year one. And it turned into kind of, a decade plus of championing a persona. Now, what that means effectively was a portfolio of content marketing programs that basically kept executing that promise of education and connection. It turned into events, which I think we'll talk about more in greater depth. It turned into, podcasts, virtual programs, all these types of things. And ultimately, the end result for the company was, one, a new category was established around their space. The company that sort of championed the growth of that was aligned as sort of the thought leader, aligned with the movement that they were sort of creating. And most of the demand generation, I believe, something to the tune of 80% was sourced directly through these thought leadership programs. So somebody came in through a content program, eventually took a call, and then eventually became a customer. So the power of thought leadership to establish the category, but then monetize it into revenue was really impactful.
So paint a picture of like there was an existing product, you worked with analysts, you listened to potential customers. Like, did the product itself shift, or was it just no, the product was the same? It was just the outside layer of how we went to market.
I'd say the problem never shifted in the sense of like the pain that the product was meaning to solve. The product for sure got, shaped a lot by early customers and as kind of the market started to mature. But the focus on solving that problem is something that 10 years later the company's still focused on today. So I think that's kind of a distinct thing. But certainly there has been a lot of like influence from these kind of customers on the
Yeah.
evolution.
I love the idea of just listening to the, like you said, people were in this LinkedIn group and we went and listened. How long did that go and who attended?
It was pretty. I think the company actually ended up having like a relationship with the association, basically that was planning those efforts. But it was a pretty fast turnaround in that early days from like the first participation in that meetup to hosting the first conference, something on the order of like a quarter, basically. So
Okay.
it was a magical kind of moment. And the CEO was there, the head of marketing was there. I'm not sure who else kind of attended, but certainly, the hot chief kind of, decision makers were there for that observation, which is what I think led to that buy-in to do something that most companies don't do. Like, okay, let's host a conference as an early stage business in our
Yeah.
first quarter of existence, basically.
I mean, nonetheless, it's like a great grassroots thing. I think there's so many people who just get caught up in the product in their own office space, and they're almost like nervous to go out and talk to customers.
Yeah.
So the fact that you embraced it pretty early was a good move. So
Sorry.
tell me, like, when you figured out, all right, now we've refined who we are. Now let's turn on the thought leadership. How do you decide what to do in terms of content creation? Because that's the biggest fear of a lot of B2B marketers is it's just there's too much. Am I doing video? Am I doing webinars? Am I doing
Yeah.
infographics? Is it the regular traditional white papers? Like, how do you figure out how to focus?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think continuing the observation you had earlier around listening to the audience, listening to your customers, understanding where their pain is, I think is critical to kind of making sure that we're not just creating content for content's sake, but that we're creating content that's actually going to add value to the audience. And so I'd start there. A tactical thing, you have sort of the kind of what is the intake we can take from the market, but then also like what is sort of the narrative that we want to introduce into the market as well. And on that latter point, one thing that I've seen done well is instructing companies to, this sounds kind of crazy, but like author the table of contents for the book they want to write one day about their category. Because every business book has kind of a similar structure, right? Like act one is like justification of the idea or the category or whatever. Like, why should I pay attention? Why should I invest in this category? Act two is sort of the big middle. That's the playbook, the best practices. Each chapter is one best practice of the entire kind of category. Like if you follow this handbook, you can self-actualize in this career. You can do well in this role. And then the third act is, well, what happens when we do? What is the impact to customers, the impact to our teammates, impact to investors? It seems to be kind of a semi, common kind of framework. And so what's interesting is that each chapter is effectively a almost folder of sorts for, tens of blog posts, webinars, podcast
Yeah.
episodes, themes. And what you're doing is you're starting to like frame this discussion within the umbrella arc of a story that A kind of keeps the team focused on kind of what you want to write. And then B literally could be repurposed into a book at some point as the market starts to mature. So
Yeah.
that's sort of one tip that I saw work actually pretty well in a previous company.
Yeah. I think that's a great tip. How powerful it is to almost create a physical mock-up of a book and
Yeah.
just say we're writing the table of contents. That's a great idea. So you've got the focus of the story you want to tell. Now you're a newer company. How do you actually build the content team? Like there's the in-house, there's the outsourced, there's
Yeah.
the hybrid. Like how did you go build that?
Yeah. I think it's honestly one of the most important hires in marketing period, but also just today with so much noise on the internet and your need to really stand out, it's critical. So, I think it depends on the budget. It depends on kind of the commitment, of the team. I think you could certainly benefit from a full time kind of content marketer in-house. We're an early stage company all in on content marketing and we don't have one yet because we're just early.
Yeah.
And so for other folks, you might consider working with contractors. It's pretty decent kind of freelance community around writing. specifically around writing. There's great agencies that could help support as well with like podcasts and more of the editorial kind of content. But it does come down to like, what is the sort of profile? What type? I think to your earlier question, what are we doing when we say content? Do we mean written blog posts from an SEO perspective? Do we mean editorial writing where journalism and more of the creative kind of background might be interesting? Or do we mean like media production, like video, events, digital events, podcasting, those types of things? So I do think there's sort of the three tiers are like hire somebody full time. And I think certainly as you start to mature, call it a Series A plus company, having a full time person responsible for production and distribution of content is going to be important. Augmenting that or supporting that person with potentially contractors or freelancers, of which there are many, and also just these specialty agencies, specifically also around the media side, that I think really help kind of shape the goals or shape sort of throughput on the production side.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to jump ahead. You mentioned this before when you talked about like 80% of opportunities were sourced from content. That's an amazing number. So, like, give us some other context around the outcome of everything that was built.
On the pipeline side, 80% source, 100% influenced, which was crazy. But even outbound campaigns had sort of a touch point throughout the thought leadership around the way. The company was acquired for over $1 billion. And so that's an outcome for sure. But I think most interestingly is, especially for a lot of companies operating in new categories, there's often like a people component to this. And that job function that was, again, a cottage industry that met in random office parks in Foster City, California, became one of the fastest growing jobs in the world. And LinkedIn data validated that and kind of published a lot of research around it. And so there's something sort of that as a marketer or as anyone, as a human kind of working in enterprise software feels good about the ability to help champion a job, a profession. I think that was a powerful outcome as well.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, let's do this. Let's jump into the next case study. This one is related. We're going to do a deep dive on how to put on an effective conference.
Yes, which has changed a lot over the years. I think we're all still learning, reeling from the virtual event kind of craze and everything. What do events look like now in a post-pandemic world? Because I do think things are changing. But I'll take us back to kind of, early 2010s. The idea of hosting a conference, again, feels interesting, I think, to many CEOs, certainly to some CMOs. But we all appreciate how hard events are and how expensive in many cases they are to produce. But there's something about the human component of getting together in person that's just so hard to replace and digitize or automate in marketing. And so for this business, there was a deep appreciation for that. And the company wanted to, again, with very little resources and at a very inappropriate time, if you look at any best practice, wanted to host their own event. So imagine a world where you don't have sort of, a large kind of program budget to support putting something like this on, but there is this kind of community developing around the idea. And so I think step one is sort of how we position the event. And there's an important kind of distinction here, positioning the event as an industry event and not a customer event. When we position an event as a customer event, it's great, but you're limiting your TAM of who can attend. And also it's going to be fairly product centric, or at least that's kind of the belief. And folks, you may not want to go and be sold to or view it as sort of a training kind of program. Industry makes sort of the cognitive reference be more about education or career advancement and those types of things. So you're casting a wider net for attendance. You're getting the mix of attendee might be more prospect, should be more prospect than customer heavy. Not to say we don't care about our customer attendees, but that helps create this sort of movement orientation around, okay, this is the industry conference of record for category X, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Second is like the speakers. And so speakers and the agenda really do add kind of credibility and brand equity to the event, especially if this is your first time hosting an event. And so what we've seen that customer do was pick one speaker that they went and paid for. I think they spent $20,000 or so back then, at least, might be worth a lot more now, on Jeffrey Moore, who wrote Crossing the Chasm. And he was sort of the draw, as it were. Then the idea is, okay, can you leverage the sort of pay for play keynote speaker to go get like a list of 5 to 10 other names, credible names in the industry to add their brand equity to the table? So we went to CEOs using our investor relationships in the portfolio and in just the broader network and said, hey, we have Jeffrey Moore speaking at a conference all about X. Like, do you want to be a part of it? And we got a number of yeses. And so now at this point, the rest of the agenda was not easy, but easier to kind of tell the story, because it wasn't like no name company hosting first time event. Do you want to be a part of it? It's Jeffrey Moore and Aaron Levy and all of these amazing people are going to be there. So that helped quite a bit. And finally, maybe one more point, just because I can talk all day about this one, so I'll keep it short, is how do you drive registrations to the event? After, the company had done this for over 7 years and, in different kind of global cities, one thing has remained true. The best way to get people to actually go from like hearing about your event to registering for the paid event is to drive urgency around a kind of compelling moment. Typically, those are we're selling out or early bird is ending, prices go up at midnight. Those were the only programs that actually led to spikes in registrations. Like agenda announced, great. It's important. We need to kind of educate them. Keynote speaker added, great. But only when pricing was increasing or capacity was closing did people actually feel like now was the time to register. And so think about your pricing strategy, how you develop your SKUs, what the sort of campaign calendar looks like to drive those emails towards that. The outcome for the company is they established this event as the preeminent kind of place every year where the industry gathered. It became one of the top lead sources as well for driving kind of business. Also a place they built this sort of like executive briefing center on site. So from a sales perspective, they were booking meetings with existing prospects on site at the event. And they saw a high correlation with close rates for companies that actually attended their event. So I think that's kind of the main outcome, that this event became sort of a multinational kind of global event with sister events in the UK and Australia, a virtual kind of follow-up workshop like program every summer. And it became almost this like true north for the marketing calendar, where we had these kind of major milestones across the entire calendar that we were able to drive our launches around. A number of different kind of programs were sort of calibrated to the calendar around kind of the conference plan.
Yeah, I like I like the strategy around pay for one well-known speaker. When I was doing an event years ago, someone put me in touch with essentially like a speaker broker.
Yeah.
And I talked to him and he's like, all right, here are my 30 people I represent. These are all like, they were either like former government officials that you would know, or, Navy SEALs or old athletes. And it was just so funny to just see all the prices next to these people based upon kind of what they were worth. It was almost like trading baseball cards back in the day. But it's a very powerful approach. I think I've also seen it used well if you're doing a small event for like 10 or 20 people. And instead of the person, it's essentially the restaurant. So, I'm in Chicago. There's a ton of great restaurants. Someone will pick like a top 10 restaurant and be like, we've managed to secure a private room. We'd love to have you there. And you kind of go, I've never been to that restaurant. I don't know these people. What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
So it's funny how you have to train yourself that your own company will never be the draw. Don't bank on that.
That's right. And it's so funny in 2023 now with like people, I think the burden of getting somebody to actually board a plane or go into traffic after work to go to that dinner event is even higher. It's harder to get folks to actually do that. So what you're hitting on here is like, we need an experience. There needs to be something that goes beyond sitting in the keynote hall, just listening to sessions all day, that actually gets people convicted to the point of saying yes.
Yeah. I've also seen companies use the weather to their advantage. So if you're a Midwest company, which in, 4 or 5 months out of the year, it's cold.
Yeah.
You say, hey, why would we not do a 3-day conference in Arizona in February? And that's all part of the decision-making process. I think that's when marketers really get it. They understand that you just got to know consumer behavior. And sometimes it's as ridiculous as it is.
Yeah.
If someone is like, well, I'm just going to use this as like a small vacation.
Right.
That's enough of an insight to say, fine, let's play up to that. And now they've spent 2-3 full days with us based upon that.
Totally. No, I think that's great.
All right. Well, let's do this. I want to jump into Q&A.
Cool.
Tell us about your first marketing gig. What were you doing?
So my first marketing gig was actually Gainsight. So my background is more in sales, BD, and product. And I got dropped into the head of marketing role. And so I didn't come up through demand generation, product marketing, any of the sort of background that one typically takes. It was sort of like fake it till you make it, figure it out. And thankfully, we exercised a lot of first principles that I think helped kind of shape that company's potential. But yeah, that was my first counterintuitively, I guess that was my first
Yeah.
marketing gig.
So when that was offered to you, were you like, what's going on? Like,
Oh,
this
yeah.
isn't a good fit? Or were you like, no, I got this. I love marketing.
Oh, I had no idea. No, I filled out,
Yeah.
I built a 30, 60, 90 kind of plan before getting hired for product, for leading product for that business. And then in the interviews, like, so how do you feel about marketing? I'm like, well, let me come back and figure it out. And I was on Wikipedia looking up like demand generation, trying to like get the terms right and everything. So it took me a while to figure it out. But I will say it speaks to the testament of having great mentors, people who believe in you, people who see something in you that you kind of didn't know you had in you. And that was Nick Mehta, the CEO of Gainsight, who saw the marketer in me even when I had no idea about the profession.
Yeah. All right. So now you've cut your marketing marks on the industry. So like, what is it that you love about marketing today? What's
Yeah.
the stuff that gets you most excited?
I love the people component of it. I love it's such a you get a chance to really appeal to like the emotional core of folks. And not that's not to say other professions, other kind of functions don't, but I especially love looking at the consumer marketing playbook and kind of what folks are doing and finding ways to bring that into the B2B context. Because I feel like B2B, we just lack kind of consumer marketing by about 3 to 5 years in most cases. And so it's almost like a cheat code to say, well, what's working today with streaming or the creator economy or all these other kind of verticals and D2C, and how can we kind of pull some of that into B2B as a competitive differentiator?
Yep. What drives you nuts? My go-to is the MarTech stack and how complex it is, even though it's very powerful. So you can't use that one because
Right.
that will go on forever. But besides that, what is it something that you just love to change about the industry?
I think we've created this sort of belief that brand marketing can't be measured, and investments in brand that's a cost center that is outside the context of the growth equation for a company. And I think a lot of what we talked about today, one could put under the context of brand, thought leadership, kind of community, these types of things. It drives me nuts because I found the opposite to be true across my career, that brand actually is a fundamental driver and accelerant of growth. And it can be measured for companies that are willing to do so. So that's the one that always gets under my skin.
Yep. Yep. I want to focus on working with leadership right now. So you've run companies, you've been part of other companies. As you've been a marketer, like what works well for you as it relates to bringing executives along? Like, what were you presented with situations where they're just like, this isn't happening, I don't like it, and you were able to persuade them? Like, give us a little bit of an understanding of what you've learned about managing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first component to it is making sure there's a shared vision for success. So often companies can be in like execute mode that we don't take a chance to step back and figure out where are we going and why is the work that we're doing, how is the work that we're doing actually contributing to that company goal. So
Yep.
I've pushed up for sure to get companies to step back and kind of articulate that, document it. So not have it be just something that we're all assuming, but something that actually is written and shared and expressed to the rest of the company. Second is making sure we have enough resources to actually execute the plan, because so often, there's sort of grand ideas or there's high ambition, but not enough people or budget or what have you to actually execute it. In my experience, is that's what leads to a lot of burnout and stress within teams. Is
Yep.
hey, I understand where we're trying to go, but I don't feel equipped to actually deliver. And so some of that involves resetting expectations as you sort of manage up, as well as sort of advocating on behalf of the team to get at least enough resources to execute kind of what's put in front of them.
Yep.
Those are the two things that really jump out to me that have made a lot of difference.
I've got to tell a funny story about documentation real quick.
Yeah.
So I think I've referenced this on the podcast before. We bought a home about a year ago. We've been renovating it. It's a 1930s home. And we're doing some work on the outside, and it's a stone exterior. And we're trying to find this stone, and the architect is like, I'm just trying to source this. I don't know what it is. And I go, wait, I've got a document from the original builder. It wasn't the blueprints. It was a 100-page document that outlined how the home should build. And it was all written out, just pure text. And sure enough, in the middle of this document was the quarry that they had bought the
Wow.
stone from. And I showed it to the architect, and they were like, this is unbelievable. Like, I can't believe someone went to that length to document it. And so that's my documentation story I'm going to
Incredible.
tell moving forward, was the amount of time that we saved to source it, as well as like, we now know the quarry. It's in Wisconsin.
Wow.
Go up there. I'm sure the rock's still there. Like
Yeah.
nothing's changed to that rock in 100 years. But yeah, documentation,
So important.
the most unsexy thing any marketer could do, but also
Right.
the most productive.
Right.
Looking back on your career, whether it was just in marketing or prior to that, what are some things that you've learned about yourself that you know today that you would kind of say, hey, I'd totally do this different if I had to go back in time?
I think, marketing is such a multi-disciplinary function, right? You've got a lot of like left brain thinkers, you got right brain folks. And so what I've kind of experienced about myself, maybe feeling like a bit more of a creative kind of in the process, is how emotionally attached I get to my work. And so I'm like an Enneagram 4, which basically, if you read into the Enneagram 4, you're like a creative artist that should not belong in the corporate setting, basically, is what it says, which was really encouraging when I learned that. But that shows up for me with how maybe I receive feedback on some of my work, or if we have, there's no shortage of new ideas for us, but like feeling emotionally connected to an idea, to its execution, whether it gets funded or not, those types of things. So that's something I've been more cognizant of, and trying to distance myself a little bit from work,
Yep.
as to not be completely stressed out, not unnecessarily, but not wanting to bring that home.
Yeah, I got to tell you, man, I've not done that profile, but I have to fit that thing, because the same thing early on in my career, it was like, well, if I came up with the idea, it's just a question of how we're going to implement it. It's
Right.
not, is it a good idea? And I think that took me years, is to really distance myself. And now I'm almost overly cautious when I present an idea. Sometimes, so let's say I have like an idea that I think is really good, I will present it along two other ideas and just kind of take the bias out and say, hey, it's a couple different ideas. Which one resonates with you? What do you think has
Good.
the most potential? And yeah, sometimes I have to come up with other ideas now, which is like,
Yeah.
instead of just pushing my one idea.
That's good. That's
But
good
yeah,
practice.
it's a hard thing to do. It's tough to something that you're so excited about,
Yeah.
to just step away from it and say, no one likes that idea except me.
Totally.
Except me. I
That's
should
good.
have a folder of just fun ideas that only Steve likes. All right. Anything else you want to share as we wrap up? Any different perspectives that you've learned along the way that you thought the audience might find helpful?
Yeah, I just think it's a really interesting time in B2B marketing right now. So, I've been in the industry now, it's getting close to 15 years in the function. And I've never seen so much rapid change as I have in the last 18 months, or really since the pandemic, in the terms of what channels are performing, in terms of, content marketing meant inbound marketing and SEO blog posts not 2.5, 3 years ago. And now we're on podcasts and videos and live streams, and the tool bag is changing. Audience ownership from a data model perspective is changing. Third-party cookies are going away, so it's disrupting kind of the paid distribution kind of motions. And so I'm just like really excited to see kind of how we as an industry kind of navigate through this in the years that come. But the only thing that seems for sure is that what worked in the past isn't going to be the playbook to kind of carry us into this next chapter of our industry. And so I've got a lot of optimism and excitement for kind of what's coming next.
Yeah, that's great. I think that there is so much change. And I always joke about, if you're not entirely confused about where we're headed, then you're not aware of what's happening around you, because it's so dynamic.
Yep.
It's what gets me excited. I've been doing this almost 25 years, and I still tell people, like, I don't think it's been a more fun time. And I
Yeah.
kind of did that. The internet clearly was like, oh my God, this is going to be so much fun. And
Yeah.
now it's like another wave of possibility. So I'm
Yeah.
excited about that
I
too.
mean, even in the last, year here. So it's going to be great. It's going to be awesome to see.
All right, Anthony, thank you for sharing your wisdom on the podcast today. I want to thank the listeners for joining us. As always, you can find all the content on YouTube. We publish it on the 26 Characters website as well. You could obviously go to Apple, Spotify, all the other distributors as well. So thanks again, Anthony. And we will catch you next time on Interesting B2B Marketers. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. If you found value in today's episode, please help grow the podcast by sharing with others and leaving a review. We'll see you next time.